The wind on the high Mongolian steppe does not blow, it strikes. It sweeps across vast, treeless horizons of emerald grass and gray shale, carrying the bitter chill of the Siberian taiga and testing the endurance of every living creature that dares to call the wilderness home. In this unforgiving landscape, life was measured not by years or wealth, but by resilience, mobility, and the strength of one's kin. It was into this harsh and competitive world that a boy named Temujin was born, entering a reality where survival was a daily struggle and safety was an illusion of the passing season. Temujin was born into the Borjigin clan, a lineage of nomadic pastoralists tracing their proud descent back through generations of steppe leaders. His father, Yesuje, was a prominent chieftain of the clan, a man whose authority was forged in the perpetual friction of tribal politics and resource-scarce pastures. According to the rich oral traditions and chronicles preserved by his people, such as the sacred histories handed down through generations, Temujin entered the world clutching a dark blood clot within his small hand. In the folklore of the nomads, this unusual sign was whispered to be an omen of destiny, a portent that the child was marked out for an extraordinary path. Yet, such grand prophecies were entirely divorced from the bleak reality of his early years. To his family, he was simply another mouth to feed in a camp that constantly hovered on the thin edge of subsistence. The fragile security of Temujin's childhood was shattered forever when he was roughly 9 years old. His father Yesuje, while returning from a journey across the eastern plains, fell victim to the bitter, lingering animosity between the Mongols and the neighboring Tatar tribes. Offered hospitality at a local gathering, Yesuje was secretly poisoned by his hosts, who recognized him as a dangerous adversary from past conflicts. Sensing his end approaching, Yesuje managed to send word for his young son to be brought to his side, but he passed away before Temujin could complete the long ride back to the family encampment. With Yesuje's death, the fragile political structure he had maintained dissolved instantly. In the hyper-competitive ecosystem of the 12th century steppe, loyalty was rarely given to ideals. It was anchored to power, success, and the immediate distribution of wealth and protection. Temujin was far too young to assume his father's mantle as chieftain. Recognizing this vulnerability, the leading members of the Borjigin clan and their allied factions decided that the young widow, Holun, and her children were liabilities rather than assets. Under the leadership of rival kinsmen from the Teocheid faction, the clan made a cold, calculated decision. Rather than share their camps, livestock, and dwindling pastures with a fallen leader's helpless dependents, they packed their jurs, rounded up their herds, and abandoned Holun and her children in the dead of the wilderness. To be abandoned on the open steppe without livestock, tents, or allies was tantamount to a death sentence. The clan leaders expected the harsh elements, starvation, or rival raiding parties to finish what their desertion started. Left behind by their own people, Holun and her children faced an immediate and desperate fight for existence. Holun, a woman of formidable courage and resourcefulness, gathered her young children, including Temujin, his younger brothers, and his sister, and resolved that they would not perish. The family was reduced to a primitive, hand-to-mouth existence. They scoured the riverbanks and hillsides for edible roots, wild berries, and forest plants. Temujin and his brothers learned to fashion crude fishing lines and bone hooks to catch fish from the cold waters of the Anan River. They hunted small game, birds, and marmots with miniature bows and arrows crafted from scraps of wood and horn. Every waking hour was consumed by the grueling labor required to secure enough nourishment to see another dawn. This early immersion in extreme hunger, isolation, and constant danger profoundly shaped the psychological development of the boy who would become Genghis Khan. Growing up outside the protection of a traditional tribal structure meant that Temujin and his siblings had no shield against hostile outsiders. They were frequently hunted, harassed, or robbed by rival nomads who viewed fatherless families as easy prey. In these formative years, Temujin learned that traditional aristocratic expectations, the belief that noble birth alone guaranteed respect or safety, were entirely hollow. He discovered that true survival depended on hypervigilance, adaptability, and the painful realization that loyalty on the steppe could never be merely inherited. It had to be earned, forged, and secured through iron will and mutual necessity. The quiet, vulnerable boy left behind on the banks of the Anan River was slowly hardening into a strategist, shaped by the brutal crucible of the steppe into a survivor who understood the fundamental mechanics of power long before he ever commanded an army. The abandonment of Holon and her children by the Borjigin clan left them in a state of absolute destitution on the high, windswept plains of medieval Mongolia. Without tents, horses, or stores of dried meat, the small family group had to rely entirely on their own wits and physical endurance to survive day by day. Holon assumed the heavy burden of leadership, foraging for wild plants, digging up edible roots with her bare hands, and gathering bird eggs along the riverbanks to keep her young children alive. Temujin, stepping rapidly into responsibilities far beyond his years, labored alongside his younger brothers Khazar, Hachion, and Temuj, as well as his sister Temulin, turning every waking hour into an unyielding struggle against starvation. They wove simple nets, fashioned primitive fishhooks, and crafted miniature bows to hunt small rodents and birds, learning every secret of the harsh landscape just to secure enough daily nourishment to see another dawn. Yet, physical hunger was only one of the many perils confronting the fatherless household in this hyper-competitive tribal environment where weakness invited aggression. As the family fought for survival on the margins of nomad society, deep internal tensions began to surface within the camp, driven heavily by competition over scarce resources and the fierce assertion of status among the growing boys. Temujin and his full brothers found themselves locked in a bitter, escalating rivalry with their half-brothers, Bektar and Belgute, who were born to a junior wife. In a world where every scrap of food possessed life-or-death value, disputes over hunted game and shared spoils frequently flared into open hostility. The older half-brothers, possessing greater physical strength due to their age and lineage, often claimed the best portions of fish and small game secured by Temujin and Khazar, sparking intense resentment within the household. This friction reached a tragic and violent turning point when a dispute over a freshly caught fish and a small lark escalated beyond control. Driven by anger over ongoing deprivation and a refusal to be subordinated within their own struggling family, young Temujin and Khazar resolved to settle the grievance permanently. Concealing their intent, they tracked Bektar to a remote hillside where he sat watching the family's few remaining horses. Confronted by his younger brothers, Bektar argued fiercely against internal division, reminding them of their vulnerable isolation and the hostility of the surrounding Teachiad clan. Despite his words, Temujin and Khazar drew their bows and struck him down. When the brothers returned to the encampment, their mother Holon immediately recognized the grave nature of their deed. In a severe and memorable rebuke recorded by the oral traditions of her people, she scolded her sons bitterly, comparing their impulsive violence to the destructive instincts of wild predators, and warning them that they were tearing apart the only shield they had against a hostile world. The killing of Bektar left a permanent psychological mark upon Temujin, reinforcing the brutal reality that trust was rare and that leadership required absolute authority. Stripped of romantic illusions about family harmony, Temujin matured rapidly through these grueling trials, internalizing lessons about human nature and power that would guide his actions for the rest of his life. He learned that loyalty could never be taken for granted or inherited simply through aristocratic birth. It had to be carefully managed, commanded, and earned through steadfast resolve and mutual necessity. Through hunger, isolation, and internal bloodshed, the young boy was forged into a resilient survivor, hardening his mind against sentimentality and preparing him for the immense political conflicts that awaited him across the vast expanses of the Mongolian steppe. Following years of separation and hardship, Temujin set out to fulfill the childhood betrothal arranged by his late father, traveling to the camp of the Alkanud tribe to find Bort. Despite the years that had passed and the stark contrast between his impoverished state and her family's comfortable standing, Bort agreed to marry him. Her father, Sechin, gave his blessing, recognizing a quiet, indomitable resolve in the young Borjigin survivor. The marriage united their families and brought Bort, alongside her mother Chotin, to live with Temujin's small household on the banks of the Senga River. As a wedding gift and token of alliance, Bort brought a valuable black sable coat, a luxury of immense worth on the frontier. Seeking to re-establish old bonds of protection, Temujin traveled to present this precious coat to Togrul, the powerful leader of the Karait tribe and an old sworn brother to Yesujay. Togrul accepted the gift, pledged his fatherly protection to the young man, and formally welcomed Temujin back into the complex web of steppe politics. This newly forged relationship provided the vulnerable household with a vital shield of prestige, offering a glimmer of security in a world governed by shifting loyalties. However, this fragile peace was shattered with terrifying suddenness. Deep-seated tribal grudges lingered across the plains, rooted in the turbulent past of the region. Years earlier, Yesujay had seized Holun from her Merkit suitor, an insult that the Three Merkit Confederation had never forgotten or forgiven. Seeking violent retribution and wishing to settle old scores, a band of Merkit raiders launched a nocturnal assault on Temujin's encampment. The thunder of hooves and the shouts of attackers tore through the darkness as the camp was thrown into absolute chaos. Temujin, his brothers, and his mother managed to scramble onto their horses in the dark, fleeing into the rugged safety of the surrounding hills. But in the frantic confusion of the raid, there were not enough horses for everyone. Bort was placed in a covered cart managed by a loyal servant, who attempted to drive her away from the chaos along the riverbanks. The rough terrain and panic proved fatal to their escape. The wooden axle of the cart splintered, forcing them to continue on foot before armed horsemen surrounded and captured her. When the raiders departed into the northern forests, they left behind a devastated camp and a husband whose life had once again been upended. Returning to find his home empty and his bride stolen, Temujin experienced a profound anguish that cut deeper than any physical hunger. Describing his life as hollowed out and his heart torn, he refused to accept the loss as an immutable tragedy. Recognizing that he lacked the military strength to face the Merkits alone, Temujin leaned heavily on the political relationships he had so carefully cultivated. He rode to Togrul of the Karait and called upon the alliance sealed by the Sable Coat, asking for military aid to rescue his wife. Togrul agreed, granting him thousands of warriors and advising him to seek out Jamaka, an old childhood friend of Temujin's who had grown into a powerful leader of the Jadaran tribe. This crisis forced Temujin out of isolation, transforming a personal grievance into a broad military coalition. By seeking out allies across tribal boundaries, he demonstrated an emerging diplomatic brilliance, proving that he could unite disparate factions through shared purpose, mutual respect, and strategic necessity long before he ever commanded an empire. The successful rescue of Bort from the Merkit camp marked a pivotal turning point in Temujin's life, but it also drew him deeper into the intricate and treacherous network of alliances that governed the Mongolian steppe. In the wake of that joint military campaign, Temujin found himself closely reunited with Jamaka, his Anda, or sworn brother. Their bond stretched back to their early childhood, to a time when they had twice exchanged tokens of friendship, first knuckle bones of sheep and later brass-tipped arrows, pledging their loyalty to one another before the vast, open sky. As young men, they had renewed this sacred oath under the shadow of a sacred mountain, swearing to share life and death, wealth and hardship, as if they were born of the same mother. Now, in the aftermath of the Merkit War, this reunion offered both men a powerful partnership. Jamaka had emerged as a charismatic and influential leader within the Jadaran clan, commanding respect and attracting followers through his dynamic personality, eloquence, and traditional aristocratic bearing. For a time, the two young leaders pooled their forces, camping together and combining their herds and families in a spirit of shared triumph and brotherhood. They ate from the same pot and slept under the same felt tent, living out the ideal of the Anda bond that was so revered in nomadic culture. Yet, beneath this surface of harmony, the seeds of a profound divergence in vision and leadership were already beginning to sprout. Jamaka represented the traditional aristocratic order of the steppe, where lineage, noble birth, and hereditary privilege dictated a person's standing and authority. He viewed society through the prism of clan loyalty and established custom, believing that leadership naturally belonged to those of noble bloodlines who maintained the time-honored ways. Temujin, shaped by his years of desperate exile, bitter poverty, and utter abandonment by traditional allies, looked at the world through a radically different lens. He had learned through brutal experience that inherited aristocracy offered no protection when hardship struck, and that loyalty based purely on noble birth was fickle and fragile. Instead, Temujin began to value merit, capability, personal devotion, and shared risk above all else. He welcomed anyone who showed courage, skill, and unwavering loyalty into his inner circle, regardless of whether they came from noble lineages or humble, obscure origins. This fundamental difference in their approach to authority would eventually create a rift between the two sworn brothers, transforming a deep friendship into one of the most famous and tragic rivalries in the history of the nomadic world. As Temujin's camp grew, attracting shepherds, outcasts, minor nobles, and refugees from various shattered clans, whispers and tensions began to circulate among the followers. People noticed that Temujin did not rule with the arbitrary harshness or haughty distance typical of traditional tribal chieftains. Instead, he listened to his advisors, distributed spoils fairly among all who participated in a venture, and treated his ordinary herdsmen and warriors with a level of respect that earned their fierce, emotional devotion. This egalitarian style of leadership was entirely unprecedented on the steppe. While traditional leaders demanded obedience based on their noble pedigree, Temujin commanded loyalty because he shared the labor, the danger, and the rewards with his men. The philosophical split between Jamaka and Temujin did not happen overnight, but rather unfolded through a series of subtle shifts and growing competitions for influence. As followers weighed the merits of the two leaders, many began to perceive that Temujin offered a more reliable, dynamic, and inclusive path forward. Men who had been marginalized by the rigid aristocratic hierarchy of the traditional clans found new opportunities for advancement and respect within Temujin's expanding household. Conversely, Traditionalists felt threatened by this rising wave of commoners and merit-based leaders who challenged the old ways of the steppe. The tension was further compounded by the structure of nomadic society itself, where space, pastureland, and resources were strictly limited, and two powerful leaders operating in close proximity could not easily avoid friction. The relationship between Temujin and Jamaka was thus a complex study in contrasts. Two men bound by the most sacred oath of brotherhood, yet driven by incompatible visions of how society should be organized and led. Their growing divergence was not merely a personal fallout, but a profound ideological clash between the old aristocratic order of the steppe and a new, meritocratic framework that would ultimately reshape the entire Mongolian world. The shifting alliances among the Mongol tribes added another layer of complexity to this developing rivalry. Minor clans, fearful of the growing power of both Jamaka and Temujin, constantly looked for ways to secure their own survival, sometimes switching allegiance from one leader to the other depending on immediate advantage. Temujin navigated these turbulent waters with remarkable political acumen. He understood that building a lasting power base required more than military force. It required patience, strategic generosity, and the ability to inspire trust among people who had spent generations fighting one another. When followers came to him, whether they were deserters from rival camps or impoverished families seeking shelter, he integrated them into his community rather than treating them as conquered subjects. By dispersing them among his own people and giving them shared responsibilities, he systematically broke down old tribal identities and began forging a new, unified sense of community. This deliberate method of alliance building stood in sharp contrast to Jamaka's more traditional reliance on clan solidarity and aristocratic privilege. As the months passed, the camp shared by the two Anda began to experience subtle strains. Followers loyal to Jamaka started comparing their leader's noble lineage with Temujin's humble beginnings, while those drawn to Temujin praised his fairness, his strategic vision, and his accessibility. The delicate balance of their partnership was reaching its breaking point, and the inevitable parting of ways loomed on the horizon. This looming separation would not just mark the end of a friendship, but the beginning of a titanic struggle for the soul and supremacy of the Mongolian steppe. The choices made during this formative period, the emphasis on merit over birth, the cultivation of deep personal loyalty, and the strategic navigation of tribal politics, laid the foundational stones for everything that Temujin would later achieve. Even as the bonds of brotherhood frayed under the weight of ambition and differing philosophies, the lessons learned during these years of alliance and rivalry forged Temujin into a master statesman and strategist. He was no longer merely a dispossessed boy fighting for survival. He was now a visionary leader poised to challenge the established order of the nomadic world and redefine the very nature of authority across the plains. The parting of ways between Temujin and Jamaka left a deep and lasting mark across the high plateaus of the Mongolian steppe, severing a bond that had once seemed unbreakable. When the two sworn brothers finally separated, taking their respective families, herds, and followers with them, they initiated a profound struggle that would decide the political future of the entire nomadic world. Jamaka departed with a substantial following of traditional aristocrats, noble clans, and those who clung to the ancient customs of lineage and hereditary privilege. He remained a formidable figure, commanding respect through his eloquence, his noble pedigree, and the familiar comfort of the old social order. Temujin, meanwhile, watched as a vast and diverse multitude of people chose to follow him instead. They came not because of illustrious ancestors or royal bloodlines, but because they believed in his vision, his fairness, and his ability to protect and provide for them. Among those who packed up their felt tents and drove their livestock toward Temujin's camp were shepherds, outcasts, minor clan leaders, and refugees from every corner of the steppe. They were people who had suffered under the arbitrary cruelty of traditional chieftains, individuals who had lost everything in tribal feuds, and ambitious warriors who saw in Temujin a leader who rewarded genuine skill and hard work rather than aristocratic birth. This growing community was unlike anything the steppe had ever witnessed. It was a melting pot of diverse tribal remnants, united not by blood ties or common ancestry, but by personal loyalty to Temujin and a shared commitment to a new way of living. As his camp swelled in size and influence, Temujin faced the immediate and immense challenge of organizing this disparate mass of humanity into a cohesive, functional society. He understood that traditional tribal structures, which relied heavily on rigid clan divisions and entrenched rivalries, would only tear his new community apart from within. To prevent this, he systematically began to break down the old barriers that separated people, integrating newcomers into existing households and assigning them shared responsibilities that forced them to cooperate. He replaced the capricious whims of traditional chieftains with a clear, predictable system of justice and administration. Under Temujin's guidance, rules were established that applied equally to all followers, regardless of whether they were long-time companions or recent arrivals. Spoils taken in hunts or minor skirmishes were no longer hoarded by a privileged elite. Instead, they were meticulously recorded and distributed fairly among everyone who had contributed to the effort. This revolutionary approach to fairness and resource sharing created an atmosphere of deep trust and emotional devotion among his people. Warriors and herdsmen alike knew that their leader valued their lives, respected their labor, and would never abandon them to arbitrary injustice. Yet, the consolidation of Temujin's power did not go unnoticed, nor did it happen without fierce resistance from the established powers of the region. The Mongolian steppe was a crowded and volatile landscape, dotted with powerful tribes and confederations that viewed the rise of this merit-based community with deep suspicion and alarm. Among the most prominent and threatening of these groups were the Tatars, a powerful and influential confederation of tribes located to the east, who had long dominated regional politics and maintained a bitter, historic enmity with Temujin's family. For generations, the Tatars had clashed with the Borjigin clan, and the memory of past betrayals and bloodshed hung heavily over the plains. Temujin recognized that true security for his people could never be achieved, while hostile and predatory neighbors hovered on their borders, waiting for an opportunity to strike. He began carefully planning and preparing his forces, transforming his loose collection of armed followers into a disciplined and responsive fighting unit. He instituted structural reforms within his ranks, grouping warriors into decimal units, tens, hundreds, and thousands, that transcended old tribal loyalties and ensured clear lines of command on the move and in the field. This military reorganization allowed him to deploy his forces with unprecedented speed and coordination, turning individual courage into collective tactical power. The conflicts that followed were intense, grueling, and decisive, shaping the geopolitical map of Mongolia step by step. Temujin engaged in a series of strategic campaigns against various rival groups, including the Merkit, who had once kidnapped his wife Bort, the Nayman in the west, and the influential Kharat Confederation, whose leader Togrul had once been a close ally and protector to Temujin's father. The war against the Kharat in particular was a harrowing test of endurance and diplomacy. Togrul, influenced by court intrigue and growing fears of Temujin's meteoric rise, had turned against his young protege, forcing a bitter conflict between former allies. Through superior tactical maneuvering, unshakable discipline, and his uncanny ability to inspire unwavering loyalty during moments of extreme crisis, Temujin ultimately overcame the Kharat forces. Rather than slaughtering the defeated population or scattering them to the winds as was customary among traditional victors, Temujin made a revolutionary choice that defined his entire career. He absorbed the surviving commoners and skilled warriors into his own expanding empire, treating them with respect and offering them positions based on their abilities. He did the same with the Merkit and various other fragmented groups he encountered along his path. When he finally turned his attention to the Tatars, who had posed such a persistent danger to his people, he executed a comprehensive campaign that broke their military power once and for all. Following their defeat, instead of yielding to the ancient cycle of blood feuds and merciless extermination, Temujin integrated the surviving Tatar families into his society, dismantling their separate tribal identity and dispersing them among his loyal followers to prevent future rebellions. This policy of integration and merit-based advancement was the cornerstone of Temujin's meteoric rise. Every victory brought not only new territory and livestock, but thousands of new subjects who quickly realized that life under Temujin offered greater security, dignity, and opportunity than anything the old tribal system could provide. Capable men of humble origins were elevated to positions of high command, proving that talent and loyalty were far more valuable to the community than noble ancestry. General subcommanders were chosen based on their battlefield brilliance rather than their family tree, creating an administrative and military elite that was intensely loyal, highly competent, and utterly devoted to the common vision. As the years progressed and campaign after campaign concluded in success, the geopolitical landscape of the steppe transformed dramatically. The countless small, quarreling factions, perpetual blood feuds, and chaotic shifting alliances that had plagued Mongolia for centuries began to give way to a single, centralized authority. Temujin's camp grew into a sprawling administrative center, bustling with merchants, envoys, craftsmen, and thousands of devoted subjects who looked to him not merely as a clan chieftain, but as the supreme arbiter of justice and order on the plains. The transformation from a struggling, isolated boy on the harsh steppe into a formidable political and military titan was now complete in its foundation. He had mastered the complex art of coalition building, outmaneuvered traditional aristocrats, and successfully united a fractured society through the sheer force of his strategic genius and egalitarian vision. The stage was now set for the ultimate unification of the Mongol nation, a monumental event that would elevate Temujin from a regional warlord to the undisputed master of the steppe, and prepare the world for the birth of Genghis Khan. The wind sweeping across the wide Mongolian steppe carried a rare and profound stillness in the summer of 1206. For generations, the vast grassy plains had echoed with the sounds of endless tribal warfare, the clashing of swords, the cries of raiding parties, and the bitter weeping of families torn apart by blood feuds. From the towering peaks of the Altai Mountains to the sprawling reaches of the great rivers, no single leader had ever managed to bind the fiercely independent nomadic clans into a lasting unity. But the world of the steppe was changing forever. Following years of grueling campaigns, brilliant political maneuvering, and a revolutionary shift from aristocratic privilege to merit-based loyalty, one man stood alone at the center of this transformed landscape. Temujin had outfought, outsmarted, and ultimately outvisioned every rival who had ever dared to challenge him. Now, as the warm season brought fresh grass for the massive herds and cleared the mountain passes, thousands upon thousands of Mongol warriors, tribal elders, chieftains, families, and common herdsmen converged upon a designated gathering place near the sacred sources of the Anan River. This was no ordinary seasonal migration or temporary council of war. It was the great assembly known as the Kurultai, a monumental summit called to decide the political destiny of the entire nomadic world. The sheer scale of the gathering was unprecedented in the history of the plains. As far as the eye could see, the white felt tents of countless clans stretched across the green river valley, forming a vast, temporary city of felt and wood. Smoke drifted into the clear blue sky from hundreds of campfires, while the air hummed with the chatter of people who had spent their entire lives as bitter enemies, but now found themselves gathered under a shared banner of peace and mutual purpose. Among the crowd were veterans of Temujin's decimal military units, brave warriors from the Borjigin, the Karait, the Merkit, the Tatars, and the Nayman, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had once fought on opposing sides of bloody battlefields. They wore traditional leather and fur garments, their horses grazed in immense herds along the riverbanks, and an electric sense of anticipation hung heavy in the crisp morning air. The assembly was organized with meticulous care, reflecting the new discipline and order that Temujin had introduced to steppe society. Every clan leader, every commander of 1,000, and every respected elder understood that this moment would mark a permanent break with the chaotic past. For centuries, power had been determined entirely by ancestral pedigree, noble birth lines, and the brutal law of the strongest clan taking what it wanted. But the men and women gathered by the Anan River knew that Temujin had forged a completely different path. He had elevated humble shepherds and forgotten outcasts to high positions of command, rewarding genuine talent, unwavering loyalty, and hard work rather than ancient family names. He had replaced the arbitrary cruelty of traditional chieftains with a clear, predictable system of justice and administration that applied equally to all followers. Because of this, the crowd did not view him merely as a successful warlord or a conqueror who had defeated his neighbors. They looked to him as an indispensable protector, a brilliant organizer, and the only leader capable of bringing enduring harmony to the high plateaus. As the designated day of the great ceremony arrived, the leaders of the various clans and confederations moved toward the center of the camp, where a raised wooden platform and sacred banners had been prepared. The atmosphere shifted from bustling excitement to a deep, reverent silence as Temujin approached. He walked with a calm, commanding presence, dressed in traditional Mongolian attire, his face bearing the weathered lines of a lifetime spent outdoors through harsh winters and grueling campaigns. He was flanked by his most trusted generals, loyal companions, and members of his immediate family, who had shared every hardship of his remarkable journey, from an abandoned, starving boy on the steppe to the undisputed master of the realm. Standing beside him was his devoted wife Bort, who had endured the trauma of kidnapping, years of separation, and the constant threat of danger to remain his rock and counsel through every trial. Also present were his loyal brothers, his sons, and the dedicated commanders who had transformed his vision of a united people into an unstoppable reality. The senior shaman of the steppe, a powerful and revered spiritual figure known as Kakachu, also known as Teb Tengri, stepped forward to perform the sacred rituals that would consecrate the momentous occasion. The shamans of Mongolia served as the intermediaries between the mortal world and the eternal blue sky, Tengri, who watched over the affairs of humanity and granted success to those who acted with destiny on their side. Kakachu addressed the massive assembly, proclaiming that the eternal sky had blessed Temujin's mission and chosen him to unite all the people who lived in felt tents under a single supreme ruler. The shaman declared that from this day forward, a new title must be bestowed upon him, a title that would command respect across every corner of the earth and echo through the corridors of history for centuries to come. With a unified voice that resonated across the river valley, the assembled chieftains, warriors, and elders shouted their overwhelming approval, proclaiming Temujin as the supreme ruler of the Mongol nation. They bestowed upon him the legendary title of Genghis Khan. While historians have debated the exact linguistic origins of the name, often associated with words meaning universal ruler, oceanic leader, or fierce oceanic strength, its immediate political and psychological impact was absolute. In that single, defining moment, the fractured collections of warring tribes ceased to exist as independent entities. They were no longer Tatars, Merkits, Karaits, or Naimans, constantly plotting against one another in an endless cycle of revenge and bloodshed. Instead, they were forged into a single, cohesive people, the Mongols. The psychological weight of this transformation cannot be overstated. By accepting the title of Genghis Khan, Temujin symbolically erased the ancient ethnic and clan divisions that had torn the steppe apart for generations, replacing them with a broader, inclusive national identity. Every person within the newly declared empire now belonged to a single collective family, bound together not by bloodlines, but by allegiance to the great Khan and obedience to the new laws of the state. Following the emotional culmination of the coronation ceremony, Genghis Khan immediately turned his attention to the practical work of governing his vast new realm, and ensuring that this hard-won unity would endure long into the future. He understood that proclaiming a title was only the first step. Maintaining an empire of diverse nomadic tribes required structural reforms, clear legal codes, and a centralized system of command that could prevent internal rivalries from resurfacing. To achieve this, he initiated a series of sweeping political, administrative, and military reforms that fundamentally restructured Mongolian society from top to bottom. First, he formalized and expanded the decimal military system that had served him so brilliantly during his rise to power. Every single Mongol warrior was assigned to a specific decimal unit: tens, hundreds, thousands, and tumens, consisting of 10,000 soldiers. These units were carefully engineered to cut across old tribal boundaries, mixing men from different backgrounds and clans into the same formations. This crucial measure ensured that soldiers fought not for the glory of a localized family chief, but for their immediate comrades and the overarching command of the great Khan. Promotion within these military ranks was based strictly on demonstrated skill, bravery, and tactical brilliance on the battlefield, creating a meritocratic elite that was fiercely loyal, highly professional, and utterly dependable. Next, Genghis Khan addressed the vital need for a written law and a reliable administrative apparatus to maintain internal peace and order across the expansive plains. Although the Mongols had traditionally relied on oral customs and unwritten traditions, the great Khan recognized that a growing Eurasian empire required a standardized legal code that could be understood and enforced everywhere. He commissioned the codification of the Yassa, a comprehensive body of traditional laws, decrees, and regulations that governed everything from military conduct and diplomatic immunity to property rights, taxation, and social behavior. The Yassa placed severe penalties on crimes that threatened community stability, such as theft, adultery, false witnessing, and tribal infighting, while strictly protecting the rights of merchants, envoys, and religious practitioners. To ensure that these laws were properly administered across the vast territories, Genghis Khan instituted a sophisticated system of written records and administration. Because the traditional Mongol language was purely oral and lacked a writing system suitable for government bureaucracy, he took the decisive step of adopting the vertical script of the neighboring Uyghur people, adapting it to the Mongolian tongue. He appointed literate Uyghur scribes, administrators, and scholars to key positions within his court, establishing a permanent chancellery that could record imperial decrees, maintain census records, manage tax collections, and facilitate diplomatic correspondence with neighboring realms. This crucial adoption of a written script transformed the Mongols from a purely illiterate nomadic society into an organized political power capable of managing complex administrative tasks across immense distances. Furthermore, Genghis Khan established an extraordinary communications network known as the YAM system. This ancient precursor to the modern postal relay service consisted of regular staging posts set at strategic intervals across the steppe and beyond. At each station, fresh horses and rested riders stood ready to receive official messages, imperial decrees, and intelligence reports, allowing dispatches to travel thousands of miles in a fraction of the usual time. The YAM system ensured that the Great Khan maintained absolute control over his expanding military commanders and administrators, receiving real-time updates from distant frontiers and issuing rapid instructions wherever they were needed most. In addition to these administrative and military innovations, Genghis Khan implemented a remarkably progressive policy of religious tolerance throughout his emerging empire. Living among a deeply spiritual people who practiced a blend of shamanism, Tengrism, Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, and Islam, the Great Khan understood that forcing a single religious doctrine upon his diverse subjects would only invite rebellion and civil unrest. He decreed that all religious leaders, priests, monks, and holy men were exempt from taxation and mandatory public service, provided they prayed sincerely for his health and the success of the empire. This pragmatic approach not only secured the goodwill of religious communities within conquered territories, but also fostered an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and cultural exchange within the imperial court, where scholars and spiritual leaders from different civilizations could debate and share their knowledge freely. As the Grand Assembly by the Anan River drew to a close, and the thousands of participants began packing up their felt tents to return to their seasonal pastures, the geopolitical reality of Eurasia had changed forever. The man who had once been a hunted, starving fugitive hiding in the freezing forests of the Burkhan Khaldan mountain was now the supreme ruler of a united Mongol nation. He had bridged ancient divides, created a revolutionary merit-based society, established a sophisticated legal and administrative framework, and forged the most disciplined military machine the world had ever seen. The fragmented tribes of the high plateaus were gone, replaced by a centralized, confident empire whose ambitions were no longer confined to the borders of Mongolia. The foundation for a global superpower had been firmly laid, and the world outside the steppe was about to face the unstoppable momentum of the Great Khan. The wind sweeping across the wide Mongolian steppe carried the distant rumble of hooves, a sound that struck absolute terror into the hearts of empires from the Yellow Sea to the banks of the Danube. As the newly proclaimed Great Khan forged a unified nation from the fractured tribes, he realized that maintaining this vast coalition required something far more powerful than temporary alliances or scattered raiding parties. To conquer the world beyond the grasslands and protect his people from future fragmentation, Genghis Khan had to completely reinvent the art of warfare. He looked at the traditional nomadic way of fighting, which had historically relied on loose bands of independent horsemen acting on impulse, and transformed it into a disciplined, highly coordinated, and scientifically organized military machine. Every element of Mongolian society was systematically restructured to support this ultimate instrument of conquest, turning the entire population into a dynamic, highly mobile military force, capable of outmaneuvering every traditional civilization it encountered. At the foundational core of this military revolution was the decimal system, a brilliant organizational reform that replaced old tribal loyalties with absolute obedience to the chain of command. Every single warrior was assigned to a strict decimal unit known as the Arban of 10 men, Thayagun of 100, the Mingan of 1,000, and the Tumen of 10,000 soldiers. These units were carefully engineered to cross old ethnic and clan boundaries, mixing men from different backgrounds into the same formations, so that no single tribal leader could maintain an independent power base. Soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder, not for the glory of a localized family chief, but for their immediate comrades within the decimal unit and the overarching command of the Great Khan. Promotion within these military ranks was based strictly on demonstrated skill, tactical brilliance, and bravery on the battlefield, creating a rigorous meritocratic elite where humble herdsmen could rise to become generals while aristocratic birth counted for nothing. This strict chain of command ensured instantaneous communication and absolute unity of action across massive distances, allowing tens of thousands of horsemen to maneuver on the battlefield with the precision of a single living organism. The personal bodyguard of the Great Khan, known as the Keshik, served as the ultimate embodiment of this elite structure and acted as the vital training ground for the empire's future commanders. Originally formed during his darkest days of struggle as a small group of loyal companions, the Keshik was expanded into a prestigious imperial guard numbering 10,000 handpicked elite warriors. It was divided into day guards and night guards, drawing sons and brothers from every Mingan across the empire. By holding these young officers close to his headquarters, Genghis Khan ensured the unwavering loyalty of all military units, while training a new generation of brilliant tacticians who understood every nuance of his strategic vision. The Keshik also served as a mobile administrative academy, providing officers who could step seamlessly into high-ranking military commands or civilian government posts across conquered territories. The true terror of the Mongol army, however, lay in its unmatched mobility and the extraordinary capabilities of the individual mounted archer. Every Mongol warrior grew up in the saddle, learning to ride almost before he could walk and developing an intuitive, instinctive connection with his horses. The horses of the steppe were hardy, stocky animals capable of enduring harsh winters, surviving on meager grazing, and traveling immense distances without breaking down. A single Mongol warrior typically maintained a string of several horses, rotating his mount frequently during long marches to ensure that his animals remained fresh and fast. This unique cavalry logistics allowed the army to cover astonishing distances in days rather than weeks, shocking sedentary empires by appearing out of nowhere across seemingly impassable terrain. Armed with the legendary composite bow, constructed from a complex laminate of wood, horn, and sinew glued together with animal adhesive, the Mongol horsemen possessed a weapon of devastating power and range. Drawing this bow required immense upper body strength, which the nomads developed through a lifetime of hunting and daily riding. They could loose a deadly volley of arrows while galloping at full speed, using a specialized saddle that provided stability and allowed them to stand in the stirrups to absorb the horse's motion. Furthermore, the Mongol archer carried different types of arrows for various combat situations, including lightweight arrows designed for long-range harassing fire and heavy, armor-piercing iron heads capable of penetrating enemy mail at close quarters. To protect themselves without sacrificing their essential speed, Mongol warriors wore lightweight armor made of boiled leather, hardened overlapping scales, or heavy silk shirts. Silk was discovered to be remarkably effective against enemy arrows. When an arrow struck silk, it did not easily puncture the fabric, but instead wrapped around the arrow point and drove it into the wound without deep tearing, allowing the silk shirt to be pulled out easily along with the arrowhead, preventing severe infection and making battlefield recovery much faster. Beyond individual skill and equipment, the tactical brilliance of Genghis Khan's armies relied on sophisticated coordination, advanced communication networks, and psychological warfare designed to break enemy morale before a sword was even drawn. Long before an invasion began, the Mongols deployed extensive scouting networks and intelligence gatherers into target regions. These spies mapped out enemy supply lines, assessed the strength of local garrisons, identified political divisions within rival courts, and gathered crucial weather and terrain data. When the army finally advanced, it moved not as a single, vulnerable mass, but in multiple parallel columns separated by vast distances, yet remaining in constant communication through couriers and signal systems. This multi-pronged approach confused enemy commanders, who never knew where the main blow would fall, forcing them to divide their own forces and rush frantically from one threatened city to another, while the Mongol columns converged at a predetermined rendezvous point with terrifying precision. On the battlefield, the standard Mongol tactics revolutionized medieval warfare through a masterclass in deception, feigned retreats, and fluid maneuverability. Rather than engaging in the traditional European or Middle Eastern style of heavy cavalry charges or static shield walls, the Mongol generals preferred fluid, dynamic combat. A common maneuver involved charging the enemy lines, launching a storm of arrows, and then staging a sudden, chaotic retreat that feigned panic and exhaustion. Enemy commanders, believing victory was within their grasp, would break their formations and rush forward in pursuit, falling straight into the trap. Once the pursuers were strung out and disorganized, the fleeing Mongols would wheel around with breathtaking speed, surrounding the enemy on all sides and unleashing a relentless barrage of arrows from a safe distance before closing in for the final defeat. This combination of psychological intimidation, relentless mobility, and flawless tactical coordination meant that opposing armies were frequently defeated before they even understood how the battle had unfolded. Behind this tactical mastery stood an advanced logistical and intelligence apparatus that transformed the steppe army into a strategic marvel. Communication across the vast expanses of the expanding empire was maintained through the YAM system, an ancient postal relay network featuring staging posts set at regular intervals where riders could swap horses and deliver messages with astonishing speed. This system allowed Genghis Khan to coordinate military campaigns across thousands of miles, receiving real-time intelligence from distant frontiers and issuing precise operational orders to his generals. In addition to mobility and communication, the Mongols proved remarkably adaptable in siege warfare, shedding their traditional reluctance to attack fortified cities as their ambitions expanded beyond the open steppe. When encountering massive stone walls or heavily fortified urban centers in China and Central Asia, Genghis Khan did not rely solely on brute force or starvation tactics. Instead, he systematically recruited, captured, and integrated foreign engineers, siege experts, and technicians from conquered populations. Muslim engineers, Chinese siege masters, and Christian artisans worked side by side within the Mongol military infrastructure, constructing massive catapults, battering rams, trebuchets, and gunpowder-based incendiary devices. The Mongols quickly learned how to divert rivers, build enormous wooden siege towers, and employ psychological terror by offering generous terms to cities that surrendered immediately, while ruthlessly destroying those that chose to resist. This pragmatic synthesis of traditional nomadic horsemanship with advanced foreign technology created an unstoppable military force that rendered traditional medieval fortifications obsolete. By the time Genghis Khan completed his military reforms, he had created an army unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was disciplined, meritocratic, highly mobile, technologically adaptable, and bound together by an unbreakable code of shared purpose. The individual warrior was no longer just a tribal herdsman defending a local pasture, but an integral part of a global military machine whose reach was about to extend far beyond the borders of Mongolia. The open world lay before them, and the horsemen of the steppe were ready to change the course of human history forever. With the unification of the steppe tribes firmly established, and his military machine meticulously honed, Genghis Khan turned his gaze beyond the natural boundaries of Mongolia, setting into motion campaigns that would transform a regional confederation into a sprawling Eurasian empire. For generations, the pastoral nomads of the plains had occasionally raided settled agricultural civilizations for goods, livestock, and grain, but these incursions had always been temporary and localized. Under the leadership of the great Khan, however, warfare ceased to be mere seasonal raiding and evolved into a systematic, strategic expansion designed to secure trade routes, subjugate neighboring powers, and project permanent imperial dominance across the civilized world. The first major theater of this trans-steppe ambition lay to the south and east, where northern China was governed by the wealthy and powerful Jurchen-led Jin dynasty. The Jin rulers, who had long manipulated steppe politics by playing various nomadic tribes against one another, viewed the rise of the unified Mongol nation with profound alarm and haughtily demanded submission from Genghis Khan. Far from submitting, the great Khan treated the insult as a declaration of war, launching a massive invasion across the Great Wall in 1211 that shattered long-standing geopolitical assumptions in East Asia. The conflict against the Jin dynasty presented an entirely new kind of military challenge for the nomads, as they encountered an ancient civilization defended by massive fortifications, millions of infantrymen, and heavily fortified urban centers. Rather than attempting direct, frontal assaults against impregnable stone walls, Genghis Khan deployed his mobile cavalry to systematically ravage the countryside, outmaneuver imperial field armies, and cut off supply lines while avoiding costly sieges in the initial phases. The psychological impact of the Mongol advance was devastating. As horsemen swept through northern provinces, refugees flooded into walled cities, creating widespread panic, economic collapse, and severe food shortages that crippled the Jin defense from within. By 1214, the Mongol army had reached the imposing walls of the Jin central capital, Jiangdu, modern-day Beijing. Facing starvation and total ruin, the Jin emperor was forced to sue for peace, offering an astronomical tribute consisting of thousands of horses, vast quantities of gold, silver, silk, and even an imperial princess before eventually relocating their court further south. Even as operations in northern China continued under his trusted generals, Genghis Khan's ambitions expanded simultaneously toward the west, drawing the burgeoning empire into direct contact with the wealthy and sophisticated Islamic states of Central Asia. The vast territories of the Khwarazmian Empire, stretching from the shores of the Caspian Sea across Transoxiana into modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan, represented the commercial and cultural crossroads of the Silk Road. Initially, Genghis Khan sought peaceful commercial relations, viewing the Khwarazmian ruler, Shah Muhammad Roman II, as a potential trading partner rather than an immediate military target. He dispatched a massive commercial caravan laden with gold, silver, silk, and precious goods, accompanied by Muslim and Mongol merchants, hoping to establish mutually beneficial economic ties that would link the steppe directly to the markets of the Islamic world. However, this diplomatic overture met with a catastrophic end in the border city of Otrar, where the local Khwarazmian governor, driven by greed and suspicion, seized the caravan's goods and executed the merchants on unverified charges of espionage. Seeking a peaceful resolution, Genghis Khan sent a small diplomatic delegation to demand the extradition of the corrupt governor and reparations for the crime. But Shah Muhammad Roman II committed an unforgivable breach of international law by murdering the chief ambassador and shaving the beards of his companions, sending their battered bodies back in humiliation. This unprovoked outrage sealed the fate of the Khwarazmian Empire. Genghis Khan withdrew to a sacred mountain on the steppe to fast and pray for guidance, emerging with the conviction that divine mandate compelled him to punish the arrogant Shah and sweep away a regime incapable of honoring sacred diplomatic conventions. The subsequent mobilization brought together the finest military minds of the Mongol world, drafting contingents from every subjugated tribe and incorporating foreign technical specialists into an unstoppable expeditionary force that marched westward across the mountains and deserts. The war beyond the steppe thus marked a profound evolutionary leap for the Mongol state, transitioning from a localized defense of the Mongolian plateau into a global phenomenon. By launching simultaneous, multi-pronged campaigns against the formidable Jin dynasty in the east and the sprawling Khwarazmian Empire in the west, Genghis Khan demonstrated a panoramic strategic vision that encompassed the entire breadth of the Eurasian continent. The campaigns tested the limits of endurance, logistics, and tactical adaptability, proving that the decimal military structure and peerless mobility developed on the open grasslands could successfully dismantle ancient, urban-based civilizations. As the smoke of conquest rose over the horizon of Central Asia and northern China, the world was irrevocably altered, binding distant cultures together in a crucible of blood, trade, and unprecedented imperial integration. Following the disastrous events at Otrar and the brutal execution of Mongol ambassadors by the Khwarazmian governor, the fragile peace between the rising Mongol Empire and the Islamic world was shattered beyond repair. Shah Muhammad Roman II of Khwarazm had severely miscalculated the character and resolve of Genghis Khan, viewing the pastoral nomads as mere uncivilized raiders rather than a disciplined and methodical military superpower. By murdering diplomats, a crime universally recognized across cultures as an intolerable violation of international law, the Shah sealed the fate of his vast empire. Genghis Khan, having spent days in solitary prayer and fasting upon a sacred mountain on the steppe, descended with the absolute conviction that divine mandate required him to deliver swift and total retribution. The stage was set for one of the most cataclysmic military campaigns in human history, an invasion that would sweep across Central Asia and permanently reshape the geopolitical landscape of the medieval world. Unlike previous tribal skirmishes on the open grasslands, the campaign against the Khwarazmian Empire required confronting a massive, wealthy state boasting hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers, formidable mountain passes, and heavily fortified urban centers that anchored the bustling trade routes of the Silk Road. The Khwarazmian Empire stretched from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, encompassing legendary, cultured cities such as Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench. Yet, despite its enormous size and wealth, the empire suffered from fatal internal weaknesses. Shah Muhammad Roman II did not trust his own generals or his diverse subjects, many of whom had been recently conquered and felt little loyalty to the central regime. Instead of concentrating his massive forces to meet the invading Mongols in a decisive field battle, the Shah chose a defensive strategy, scattering his armies across dozens of isolated fortified cities. This tactical error played directly into the hands of Genghis Khan, allowing the Mongol military machine to isolate, surround, and conquer urban centers one by one. In the autumn of 1219, the great Mongol host, numbering well over 100,000 seasoned warriors and reinforced by foreign auxiliary troops and siege engineers, descended upon the frontier city of Otrar. The siege of Otrar lasted for months, a grim demonstration of the systematic methodology the Mongols brought to urban warfare. When the outer defenses finally crumbled and the city fell, the treacherous governor who had sparked the war was captured, and the city was systematically dismantled, though its skilled artisans and craftsmen were spared and integrated into the growing Mongol logistical network. From Otrar, Genghis Khan executed a brilliant and unexpected strategic maneuver. Rather than pressing forward along predictable routes, he split his forces into multiple columns. The most daring maneuver involved leading the main army directly across the forbidding Kizilkum Desert, a waterless, scorching expanse that the Khwarazmians believed was entirely impassable for a massive military force. Using local guides and relying on disciplined logistical planning, the Mongol cavalry emerged from the desert completely undetected directly behind enemy lines, appearing suddenly outside the walls of the holy and opulent city of Bukhara in early 1220. Bukhara, a crown jewel of Islamic learning, commerce, and culture, was thrown into utter panic by the sudden apparition of the Mongol horsemen out of the desert haze. While the citadel held out for a brief period under a garrison of elite troops, the city's religious leaders and civic elite realized the hopelessness of resistance and opened the gates to spare their people from total destruction. Genghis Khan entered the city and famously addressed the prominent citizens from the pulpit of the main mosque, declaring himself the instrument of divine wrath sent to punish them for their ruler's sins. Rather than indulging in mindless slaughter, the Mongols imposed a heavy indemnity, commandeered supplies, and registered the city's craftsmen and engineers for service, leaving the architectural splendor of Bukhara largely intact while securing a crucial operational base. Following the submission of Bukhara, the Mongol armies converged upon Samarkand, the magnificent capital of the Khwarazmian Empire and the beating heart of trans-Eurasian trade. Samarkand was heavily fortified with massive stone walls, deep defensive ditches, and a garrison of tens of thousands of skilled defenders. The siege was fierce and bloody, featuring coordinated assaults, intensive bombardment from newly acquired Chinese siege engines, and relentless psychological pressure. Recognizing the overwhelming force and relentless pressure of the besiegers, a portion of the garrison attempted a desperate sortie, while others surrendered in stages. When the city finally fell, its defenders were dealt with severely to deter future resistance, yet the administrative machinery and vital economic infrastructure of the region were carefully preserved. Thousands of artisans, scholars, and technical specialists were spared from the destruction and sent eastward toward Mongolia, ensuring that the knowledge, skills, and cultural achievements of the conquered Islamic world were absorbed directly into the expanding empire. With Samarkand subdued, the net closed tightly around Shah Muhammad Roman II. Refusing to offer a unified defense or rally his remaining forces, the demoralized Shah fled westward across his own empire, pursued relentlessly by elite Mongol scouting columns led by legendary generals Jib and Subutai. The pursuit became an epic chase across the mountains and plains of Persia, driving the ruler from city to city, until he found himself utterly abandoned, destitute, and terrified. Shah Muhammad Roman II ultimately sought refuge on a desolate, marshy island in the Caspian Sea, where he died in obscurity and poverty shortly thereafter, broken in body and spirit by the relentless whirlwind he had unleashed. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan turned his attention to the rich and sprawling city of Urgench, the capital of the Shah's formidable mother, Turkin Khatan. The siege of Urgench proved to be one of the most grueling and bitter engagements of the entire campaign, as bitter street-to-street fighting and fierce resistance turned the city into a devastating battleground before it finally fell. The collapse of the Khwarazmian Empire sent shockwaves throughout the civilized world, fundamentally altering the balance of power across Eurasia. In the span of just a few years, a centralized, wealthy Islamic superpower had been entirely dismantled through a combination of brilliant strategic deception, psychological warfare, unmatched cavalry mobility, and flawless military coordination. While the campaign was marked by immense destruction and the tragic loss of life in cities that chose fierce resistance, it also marked a profound turning point in global connectivity. By breaking down the political barriers that had long divided Central Asia from the Far East, Genghis Khan united the trade routes of the Silk Road under a single sovereign authority. The Khwarazmian catastrophe, though devastating for the regimes that fell before it, opened the doors to a new era of unprecedented intercontinental exchange, binding the distinct cultures, economies, and peoples of Eurasia into a single, interconnected world. As the dust settled across the smoking ruins of Central Asia, and the vast machinery of war ground to a temporary halt, Genghis Khan faced a challenge far greater than any battlefield confrontation: how to govern an empire that spanned diverse cultures, sedentary populations, and sprawling urban centers. The pastoral traditions of the nomadic steppe, built upon tribal loyalties and seasonal migrations, were entirely inadequate for ruling millions of settled subjects in agricultural and trading civilizations. Recognizing this deficiency, Genghis Khan began constructing an innovative and pragmatic administrative system designed to maintain internal peace, collect taxes efficiently, and secure the loyalty of conquered populations without provoking constant rebellions. At the heart of this new order was the Yassa, a sweeping code of law and decrees attributed to the Great Khan, and supervised by his adopted brother and high judge, Shigi Qatuk. The Yassa served as a moral and legal foundation for the empire, establishing strict prohibitions against theft, murder, adultery, and false testimony, while standardizing punishments across diverse ethnic groups. One of the most critical legal mandates protected merchants, ambassadors, and travelers, declaring that anyone who harmed accredited traders or interfered with commerce would face capital punishment. This uncompromising protection transformed the dangerous trade routes of the Silk Road into secure corridors of movement, encouraging long-distance trade on a scale never before witnessed in human history. Merit-based promotion, which had long fueled the rise of the Mongol military, was systematically extended to civil administration. Genghis Khan discarded traditional aristocratic lineages wherever they threatened efficiency, choosing instead to reward competence, loyalty, and administrative skill, regardless of whether a man was a low-born nomad or a captured foreign scholar. To manage the immense bureaucratic and linguistic demands of his expanding domain, the great Khan recruited educated scribes, administrators, and financial experts from conquered societies, integrating Uyghurs, Persians, Chinese, and Khitans into the inner workings of his government. These literate administrators introduced record-keeping, standardized weights and measures, and managed the rapidly expanding postal relay system known as the Yam, which allowed imperial messengers to cover vast distances across Eurasia with astonishing speed. Religious tolerance was another cornerstone of Mongol governance. Genghis Khan and his successors understood that attempting to impose shamanism on Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, and Taoists would invite endless resistance. Instead, the Mongol regime adopted a policy of pragmatic neutrality, exempting religious leaders, clerics, and houses of worship from taxation and military service in exchange for their prayers and loyalty to the throne. This enlightened self-interest not only pacified religious institutions, but fostered an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity, where scholars and theologians from different worlds could meet and debate under the watchful, impartial eye of the Mongol court. Through law, trade protection, meritocracy, and administrative pragmatism, Genghis Khan transformed a confederation of nomadic warriors into an enduring, highly organized imperial state. As the vast machinery of the Mongol Empire consolidated its grip across the Eurasian landmass, an unprecedented era of transcontinental connectivity began to unfold, forever altering the economic, cultural, and technological landscape of the medieval world. The unification of the steppe and the subsequent expansion into Central Asia, China, and the Middle East brought the entirety of the traditional Silk Road under a single, centralized authority. This extraordinary geopolitical consolidation birthed what modern historians refer to as the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and stability across the imperial highways that allowed long-distance travel and commerce to flourish on a scale never before witnessed in human history. For centuries prior, merchants attempting to cross the vast distances between Europe and East Asia faced a chaotic patchwork of warring states, exorbitant local tolls, and lawless bandits that made overland journeys perilous and rare. Under the administration established by Genghis Khan and maintained by his successors, those same routes were transformed into secure, regulated corridors of movement. The strict mandates of the Yassa, which imposed the death penalty on anyone who harmed accredited merchants, ambassadors, or travelers, created an environment of unprecedented security where caravans laden with precious commodities could traverse thousands of miles with reasonable confidence. Spices, silk, porcelain, and tea flowed steadily westward toward the markets of the Middle East and Europe, while medical manuscripts, astronomical texts, glassware, and precious metals traveled eastward into China. Yet the movement of physical goods was only one dimension of this monumental exchange. Equally profound was the rapid cross-fertilization of ideas, knowledge, and culture. The pragmatic policies of the Mongol court encouraged the systematic transfer of skilled personnel across the empire. Administrators, astronomers, physicians, engineers, and scholars from diverse civilizations were routinely reassigned to regions where their specific expertise was most needed. Chinese siege engineers and physicians found themselves working in Persia and Central Asia, while Islamic astronomers and physicians traveled to the imperial capital in Mongolia and northern China, establishing bureaus to refine calendars and medical practices for the multi-ethnic realm. At the heart of this vast web of communication was the YAM, the highly efficient imperial postal relay system. Consisting of strategically placed relay stations spaced roughly a day's ride apart. The YAM allowed imperial messengers carrying documents written in Uyghur script and multilingual identity tablets, known as Pesa, to cover astonishing distances across Eurasia in a fraction of the time previously required. This rapid communication network ensured that the central court could maintain tight administrative control over distant provinces, while enabling diplomats, merchants, and official travelers to move swiftly from one end of the empire to the other. Furthermore, the religious tolerance practiced by the Mongol rulers fostered an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and coexistence, where diverse faiths, including Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Taoism, interacted under the impartial oversight of the imperial administration. Monasteries, mosques, and churches were granted tax exemptions, allowing religious leaders and scholars to debate philosophy and theology freely. Through these interconnected networks of trade, diplomacy, and scholarship, the world outside the steppe was opened up, breaking down ancient isolation and laying the vital early foundations for global interaction and modern connectivity. As the grand tapestry of transcontinental trade and communication flourished under the framework of the Pax Mongolica, the life of the man who had set this monumental transformation into motion drew quietly toward its inevitable close. In the late summer of 1227, aged and worn by decades of relentless campaigning, Genghis Khan faced his final test during a renewed military expedition against the Western Xia Kingdom, or Tangut realm, which had previously evaded full compliance with Mongol demands. The campaign, undertaken along the upper reaches of the Yellow River, demanded the familiar resilience that had defined his rise from the isolated steppes of his youth to the master of Eurasia. Yet, physical endurance had its limits. The exact circumstances surrounding the final days of the Great Khan have long remained shrouded in historical ambiguity and fierce debate among chroniclers. Some accounts, including traditional Mongol oral histories, point to the lingering effects of a severe illness or injuries sustained from a fall from his horse during the rigors of campaign life, while external observers offered diverse legends ranging from battle wounds to campaign fatigue. Regardless of the immediate medical cause, it became glaringly apparent to his inner circle, his loyal sons, and his seasoned commanders that the aging conqueror was breathing his last far away from his beloved ancestral homeland. The death of Genghis Khan in August 1227 presented an immediate and profound crisis for the nascent empire. At a time when the Western Xia capital was on the verge of final collapse, news of the supreme leader's demise, if leaked prematurely, could have galvanized remaining enemies, invited chaotic rebellions across newly conquered territories, and fractured the delicate political cohesion of the Mongol elite before a successor could be securely designated. To prevent any strategic exploitation of this vulnerability, the imperial leadership executed a deliberate policy of absolute silence. In accordance with strict military discipline, the campaign continued unabated under the fiction of his living presence, masking the profound loss from both allies and adversaries, until the final surrender of the Tangut leadership was safely secured. Only then did a solemn, heavily guarded funeral cortege begin the long, mournful journey eastward across the vast expanses of the steppe, carrying the mortal remains of the great Khan back toward the sacred landscapes of his birth in the Kentai Mountains, near the headwaters of the Anan River, and the shadow of the hallowed Burkhan Khaldun. True to the traditional customs of his nomadic heritage and his personal desire for unpretentious finality, Genghis Khan had expressed a wish to return to the earth without monuments, elaborate markers, or artificial shrines to disturb his eternal rest. The burial site was intended to blend seamlessly back into the wild, majestic topography of the Mongolian wilderness that he had spent his entire life unifying. To preserve this absolute anonymity and protect the sacred site from desecration, grave robbery, or political exploitation by future generations, the funeral escort implemented measures of extraordinary severity. According to widely recorded historical traditions and traveler accounts from the era, any unfortunate witnesses encountered along the long path of the funeral procession were systematically eliminated to ensure that no living soul could trace the precise route taken by the cortege. Upon arrival at the chosen mountainous sanctuary, the soldiers who completed the final interment were themselves sworn to eternal secrecy through a cascading chain of security, designed to leave no survivors who knew the exact coordinates of the tomb. Horses were reportedly driven repeatedly over the freshly disturbed earth to trample any trace of human excavation, and nature was left to reclaim the terrain through drifting soil, encroaching roots, and thick permafrost. For nearly 8 centuries, this meticulous shroud of secrecy has held fast, defying every modern archaeological expedition, satellite survey, and historical inquiry aimed at pinpointing the final resting place of history's most successful military commander. Yet, the physical absence of a marked tomb or monumental mausoleum only served to deepen the legendary status of Genghis Khan, transforming him from a mortal ruler into an enduring mythic figure deeply intertwined with the geography and spirit of Mongolia itself. As the funeral party melted back into the windswept grasslands, and the news of his death inevitably rippled across the vast empire he had forged, the monumental reality of his passing set the stage for a critical transition. The man was gone, but the intricate political structures, the unified military machine, and the sweeping continental vision he engineered remained fully intact, poised to propel his successors even further across the civilized world. The quiet concealment of Genghis Khan's death in the late summer of 1227 marked not the end of the Mongol enterprise, but rather its most critical test of institutional survival. Throughout history, nomadic confederations in the Eurasian steppe possessed a notorious tendency to disintegrate rapidly upon the death of a charismatic leader. Tribal loyalties were intensely personal, tied directly to the military success, charisma, and generosity of a single chieftain. When that chieftain perished, rivalries, blood feuds, and competing ambitions invariably tore the coalition apart, returning the tribes to endless cycles of internal warfare. Yet, the empire left behind by Genghis Khan had evolved far beyond a loose collection of temporary alliances. Through years of deliberate structural reform, the introduction of the decimal military system, the codification of administrative traditions, and the replacement of traditional tribal bloodlines with a merit-based command structure, the great Khan had engineered a resilient state apparatus. The death of the founder left a profound emotional void, But the intricate machinery of the empire continued to function with terrifying efficiency, poised to launch its armies even deeper into the heart of Eurasia. At the center of this transition stood the surviving sons of Genghis Khan, Jachai, Chagatai, Urgidai, and Talyui. Though Jachai had passed away a few months prior to his father, his lineage remained a pillar of the imperial family, while the remaining brothers prepared to fulfill their father's grand vision under the guidance of the Yassa and the council of elders known as the Kurultai. According to Mongol custom and the explicit wishes of the late conqueror, the supreme leadership required formal ratification by a gathering of all princes, generals, and tribal leaders. While preparations were made for this grand assembly, the immediate administration of the vast empire was guided by Talyui, the youngest son, who served as regent during the interim period. This orderly transfer of authority demonstrated the remarkable political maturity that the Mongol elite had achieved under Genghis Khan's guidance, ensuring that succession disputes were temporarily set aside in favor of collective stability and continued military expansion. In 1229, 2 years after the death of the founder, the Great Kurultai was convened in the heart of Mongolia to officially determine the succession and chart the future course of the empire. After careful deliberation and in accordance with Genghis Khan's prior wishes, Urgidai was chosen as the new Great Khan. Urgidai possessed a temperament distinct from his formidable father. He was known for his genial nature, his love of celebration, his generosity, and his sharp political intuition. While Genghis Khan had been the architect of conquest and state building, Urgidai proved to be an exceptionally capable consolidator and diplomat, adept at balancing the fierce independence of Mongol commanders with the complex administrative needs of sedentary populations. Under his leadership, the empire expanded its institutional framework, establishing permanent administrative centers, regularizing tax collection, and constructing the YAM, the revolutionary postal relay system that connected the furthest corners of the realm with instantaneous communication. With the political foundation secure, the Mongol military machine turned its attention back outward, resuming the massive expansion campaigns that Genghis Khan had set into motion. The Western Xia kingdom, which had witnessed the final days of the founder, was fully subjugated shortly after his death, integrating its territory and resources into the growing empire. Soon after, the formidable military apparatus directed its focus toward the Jin dynasty in northern China. Allied with the southern Song dynasty, the Mongol armies under Urgidai and his brilliant generals, including the legendary General Subutai, systematically dismantled Jin resistance. The capture of the Jin capital of Kaifeng in 1234 marked the complete collapse of Jurchen power in northern China, bringing millions of new subjects and vast agricultural wealth under Mongol control. The campaigns in China demonstrated that the tactical brilliance and strategic discipline instilled by Genghis Khan had not only survived his passing, but had been perfected by the next generation of commanders. Simultaneously, the western frontiers of the empire experienced an unprecedented wave of expansion. A massive military campaign was launched into Eastern Europe and the Kipchak steppe, led by princes and generals such as Badu Khan, the son of Jachai and Subutai. This sweeping western expedition pushed deep into the Russian principalities, reducing ancient cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev to submission by the early 1240s. The Mongol armies then pressed further into Central Europe, defeating combined European forces at the Battle of Legnica in Silesia and the Battle of Mohyl in Hungary within days of each other in 1241. For a terrifying moment, the borders of the Mongol Empire extended to the gates of Vienna, and the shores of the Adriatic Sea, connecting the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Central Europe under a single administrative and military umbrella. The vision of a universal empire, once whispered as an impossible dream around steppe campfires, was rapidly becoming a tangible geopolitical reality. This vast territorial expansion necessitated the division of the empire into administrative spheres, which would eventually crystallize into the great successor states: the Golden Horde in the western steppes and Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Yet, despite this eventual political decentralization, the overarching legacy of Genghis Khan maintained a profound unifying influence across the continent. Trade routes were protected and revitalized. Diplomatic missions traversed Eurasia with unprecedented safety, and the exchange of scientific knowledge, religious ideas, and technological innovations flourished on a scale never before witnessed in human history. The empire left behind by Genghis Khan was far more than a military conquest. It was a permanent transformation of the global landscape, binding distant civilizations together through a web of commerce, law, and communication that outlived the dynasty itself and reshaped the trajectory of world history. The long shadow of Genghis Khan stretches across centuries of human history, leaving behind a legacy that remains as complex, brilliant, and contested as any in the annals of civilization. When Temujin first rose from the wretched poverty of the Mongolian steppe, few could have imagined that an outcast boy would forge the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. Yet, as the dust of conquest settled, and the sprawling successor states took root across Eurasia, historians, philosophers, and generations of ordinary people wrestled with the profound duality of the Mongol phenomenon. How is it possible to reconcile the unimaginable devastation of the wars of expansion with the unprecedented era of connection, commerce, and cultural synthesis that followed in their wake? To understand the legacy of Genghis Khan is to look directly into the heart of this historical paradox, recognizing that the very same forces responsible for widespread destruction also laid the crucial groundwork for modern global connectivity. At the core of the traditional criticism surrounding Genghis Khan and his successors is the undeniable human cost of their conquests. The expansion of the Mongol Empire was accompanied by ruthless warfare, the systematic destruction of defiant cities, and the loss of millions of lives across Asia and Eastern Europe. Chroniclers of the 13th century, writing from the perspective of besieged populations in Persia, China, Russia, and the Middle East, recorded the arrival of the Mongol armies with absolute terror, describing entire urban centers reduced to ruins and fields laid waste. For centuries, the dominant narrative in many conquered regions portrayed the Mongols merely as barbarian destroyers who brought an end to golden ages of culture and learning. This dark aspect of the imperial legacy cannot and should not be ignored, as the sheer scale of violence left deep psychological and demographic scars across vast territories, altering the political and cultural trajectories of numerous civilizations. Yet, viewing Genghis Khan solely through the lens of destruction offers an incomplete and distorted picture of his historical impact. Beyond the battlefield, the great Khan was a visionary state builder who implemented reforms that fundamentally transformed human society. He recognized that military might alone could not sustain an empire, and he established innovative systems of governance designed to unite disparate peoples under a common framework. The introduction of the Yassa, the codification of Mongol law, created a standard of order that transcended tribal loyalties and protected the rights of merchants, diplomats, and religious figures alike. By instituting strict religious tolerance, Genghis Khan ensured that Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, Taoists, and shamans could practice their faiths freely within the empire, a policy of pluralism that was extraordinarily rare for the medieval era. Furthermore, his revolutionary reliance on merit rather than aristocratic birth allowed talented administrators, scribes, and engineers from conquered cultures to rise to the highest levels of imperial service, creating a remarkably efficient meritocracy. One of the most profound and enduring achievements of Genghis Khan's legacy was the total revitalization of Eurasian trade and communication. By bringing the entire length of the Silk Road under a single sovereign authority, the Mongol Empire eliminated the countless tariffs, border disputes, and bandit threats that had previously fractured international commerce. Merchants could travel safely from the shores of the Mediterranean to the Pacific Ocean, a phenomenon later described by historians as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. This unprecedented security transformed long-distance trade, allowing silk, porcelain, spices, precious metals, and manufactured goods to flow freely across the continent. Along these same secure trade routes moved something far more valuable than material goods: ideas, technologies, and scientific knowledge. Paper-making, gunpowder, the compass, and printing techniques migrated westward toward Europe, while Islamic astronomy, medicine, and mathematics flowed eastward into China and Mongolia, sparking intellectual renaissances in multiple regions. Cultural exchange flourished on a scale previously unimaginable in human history. The Mongol imperial courts became vibrant meeting places where diplomats from the Vatican, scholars from Persia, artisans from China, and astronomers from Central Asia gathered to share knowledge and debate philosophy. Missionaries and travelers, most famously exemplified by the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, and later by travelers like Ibn Battuta, journeyed deep into the heart of Asia, bringing back to their home countries detailed accounts of lands, peoples, and customs that European and Middle Eastern societies had previously only imagined in myths. This cross-cultural pollination broke down ancient intellectual isolation, broadening the geographical horizons of humanity and planting the early seeds of a truly globalized world economy and consciousness. Even in the realms of law, military strategy, and statecraft, the organizational methods introduced by Genghis Khan left an indelible mark on subsequent empires. The decimal military structure, advanced intelligence networks, rapid communication systems like the Yam postal relay, and sophisticated bureaucratic administration served as models for later dynasties across Asia and the Middle East. The Moguls of India, the Timurids of Central Asia, and various rulers in Russia and China drew heavily upon Mongol administrative traditions and dynastic legitimacy. The descendants of Genghis Khan ruled over significant portions of Eurasia for centuries, shaping the political boundaries, ethnic compositions, and linguistic landscapes of modern nations from Eastern Europe to the Korean Peninsula. Why, then, does the name Genghis Khan continue to evoke such intense fascination, debate, and controversy across the modern world? To some, he remains the ultimate symbol of ruthless tyranny and conquest, a reminder of the dark cost of imperial ambition. Yet to others, particularly in his native Mongolia, where he is revered as the founding father of the nation, he is celebrated as a genius of statecraft, a master uniter of fractured tribes, and a legendary figure who placed Mongolia at the very center of world history. Modern scholarship has largely moved past simplistic caricatures, viewing him neither as a mere monster nor as a benevolent reformer, but as a towering historical force whose actions forever altered the destiny of humanity. Ultimately, Genghis Khan changed the world because he refused to accept the limitations of his time. He looked at a fragmented, warring steppe and saw a unified empire. He looked at isolated, hostile civilizations and saw a connected global network. The empire he built eventually fractured and faded into history, but the structural foundations, the cultural bridges, and the vast geopolitical shifts he initiated outlived the dynasty by centuries. By weaving together the disparate threads of Eurasian civilization into a single, interconnected tapestry, Genghis Khan ensured that the world would never be the same again.